he was in Geneva really two separate times, separated by about a couple of years, where he was kicked out of the city and had to go live in Strasbourg. And so we kind of look at his ministry in Geneva really in two parts. The first time that he's there, and then we'll look at his exile, and then we'll look at when he comes back. But we're going to look today, it doesn't take very long with Calvin being in Geneva before things go really badly. And then he's kicked out after less than 2 years of being there. And part of the tension had to do with how Calvin wanted the reforms to take root in the city of Geneva. So he was trying to implement all of the, not just the theology of the Reformation, but the morality, the ethics of it. And that didn't go over real well. And he was sort of forced out. There was kind of a political shift, and he was essentially booted out. Yeah, there are handouts. Sorry, I forgot. I handed a few of them out, but if anybody else wants, David, maybe just hand them to anyone who wants them. And this got me thinking, because, I don't know, you may have noticed that there's an election coming up, and we're not talking about, election in the theological sense. We're talking about the ballot box, and I'm not going to get into any of that, how you choose to vote. That's one of the privileges that we have in a democracy. But it raises the question that Calvin grappled with, and I would argue, and I think historians argue, that one of the challenges, and maybe even one of the weaknesses, is that what happened with many of the reforms is that as they were trying to implement them in Geneva, they went back to what they had under Roman Catholicism, meaning they're under Catholicism and they wanted to sort of throw off the yoke of all that oppressive and controlling stuff, in which they did, and then they put a new form of rigid structure in place. And so Calvin's, we're going to see, I'm going to expand on that a lot more, but Calvin's, that was part of the challenge that Calvin faced, is how do you take the practices of the Reformation and implement them, and it, like you're going to see, didn't always go very, very well. But what I wanted to do is read maybe I'm going to read this passage that maybe shows us some of that tension that we live with as Christians living in this world. How do we live as faithful followers of Jesus Christ while still living in a culture that may or may not necessarily share those convictions? And so I'm gonna read from 1 Peter chapter 1, and because I think Peter's letters really capture this well. And so as he opens this letter, in some ways there's not a lot of real depth here, but in other ways he manages to say an awful lot in a very short couple of verses. Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, according to the foreknowledge of God the Father in the sanctification of the Spirit, for obedience to Jesus Christ, and for sprinkling with his blood, may grace and peace be multiplied to you. You maybe don't have a map or atlas set in front of you, so all those names, Pontus and Bithynia and all of that doesn't register much with us, but what really should hit home is that phrase where he says elect exiles, because that captures two parts of who we are as Christians, whether we're in 16th century Geneva or 21st century Salem or wherever you live. We are first and foremost Christians. We are elect. We belong to God, and so our first loyalty and allegiance is to him. And yet we live as exiles. We live in this world, and we don't expect, or at least I think we shouldn't expect, that we're always going to share the values and priorities and beliefs and morals of the world around us. So walking that line and living in that tension is something that Christians have had to do since the very beginning. We don't always do it very well. Sometimes we fall off on one side, and other times we fall off on the other. So you're going to see that coming through as we look at Calvin's time in Geneva. His first time, and I'm unfairly limiting this to Calvin. Calvin was part of a much larger group of Reformed leaders. His first time was probably more heavy-handed. The second time when he returns, you'll actually see that he's gained some wisdom, and how he implements some of the reforms is tempered with with a little bit more, I would say, maybe patience and forbearance. And so it's kind of interesting to set up those two sojourns of Calvin back to back and see some of the differences. But I want to, one of the changes that Calvin implemented had to do with worship, and not style, well, some of it was style of worship, but some of the theological practices of worship. And so I thought I would open with a prayer from Calvin called Truly and Purely Worship. And so as we begin, let's let Calvin offer this prayer for us. Grant, Almighty God, that since thou hast been pleased to prescribe a rule for us by which we may truly and purely worship thee, O grant that we may follow this plain rule and never indulge our own imaginations, nor trifle with thee through our own fancies or through the foolish wisdom of our flesh, but continue in thy law and in the doctrine thine only begotten Son, our Lord, has delivered to us, so that we may advance more and more in the knowledge of that glory, the foretaste of which thou givest us now, until we shall at length fully and perfectly enjoy it, when we shall be gathered into that celestial kingdom thy Son has procured for us by his own blood. Amen. All right. First things first. I had the opportunity this past week. I was on vacation last week, and while I was there, while I was on vacation, Haley and I took a trip to Normandy, to the beaches of France, and then we spent some time in Paris. And while there, I want you to know I had you all in mind, because we took a little detour to a place. It's maybe a mile from the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and it's the place where Calvin actually lived while he was in Paris. So I thought I would just show you a couple quick pictures just to take you back for a moment before we resume where Calvin is in Geneva. You'll remember that Calvin escaped from Paris. Remember, his friend Nicholas Kopp gave a message at the University of Paris, and Nicholas Kopp was the new, the dean, the rector of the university. And so he gives this speech on commencement day, basically calling for Reformation in France. Well, if you remember that France was very heavily opposed to the Reformed teachings. They were still very heavily Catholic. So that speech did not go over very well. Calvin didn't write the speech, probably, but he had a big hand in helping Nicholas Kopp write the speech. So Nicholas Kopp had to flee, and Calvin also had to flee. And so I found the place where Calvin climbed out of the window with his bed sheets. And so I took some pictures to show you. This is the house. This is the address where Calvin lived. It's not the original building. I believe one of the buildings is original, but not all of them. You'll see what I mean in a minute. But you can see there is a plaque there that commemorates this was Calvin's place. So it's 21 Rue de Jalette in Paris. As I said, about a mile from the cathedral or Rue de Valette is what I should have said. It's about a mile from the Cathedral of Notre Dame. You can see the street sign on the left and then the plaque on the right. But here's the piece de résistance. On the left there is what most scholars and Calvin thinkers believe is the actual building where Calvin lived, and it's possible that it's even original. So it's possible that one of those windows is the window that Calvin tied all these bed sheets together and then climbed down out the window in the middle of the night in order to escape what was apparently very impending danger to Calvin's life. And so he climbed out, and the picture on the right just is me, is I'm standing on the corner. It's almost like if I'm standing here facing right to my left is that picture, and then that is the university. The picture on the right is a picture of the University of Paris. It's where Calvin studied. And so there's all these little colleges around in and around that area. So that just, I thought while we were there, I would go and take a couple of pictures of the stuff about Calvin, and then now I can write it off on my taxes. I can write off my vacation. No, I'm just kidding. I got Jerry in here, so I have to be careful. But really, it was kind of neat just to take a little detour and see some of these sites that where Calvin actually lived in Paris. There's not a whole lot more in Paris. You can find a few blocks, or probably about another mile or so from there, you can actually find where he went to, not primary school, but like, remember I said he was in he studied, I think he was in Paris by the time he was around 12 years old, and studying the three main subjects, grammar, logic, and...
The trivium.
Yeah, the trivium, thank you. I knew it was tri. It's like, anyways. So those three main subject areas that he was studying while he was in Paris. The street that he lived on was maybe a mile or so from there. We were kind of tired, so I didn't make it all the way there to that street, but that gives you a sense of his neighborhood where he lived when he was closer in his 20s, or very early 20s. So anyways, that's I thought I would just show that to you, and so you can kind of see. But we've kind of moved on. So Calvin escapes from Paris, and remember, he goes, and his plan was to go and live kind of a quiet life of study. He didn't really want to be a pastor. He didn't really want to even really be a teacher. He just wanted to kind of be left alone so that he could write his theology, so that he could spend his time, because he believed that he could probably best contribute to the life of the church through his work of theology, of writing and studying. But you remember there was a war that was going on, and so the king's troops were blocking the way to the main highway, and so he has to take this long detour. It was like, it wasn't just like, your commercial streets closed, you kind of wind through a couple blocks and it's not a big deal, but Calvin's detour was hundreds of miles out of his way. He had to avoid the king's troops, and so he ends up in Geneva. But he only intends to be there for one night. This was like his B&B. He was going to crash, get something to eat, and then keep going on his way to Strasbourg. But while he's there, word gets out that he's on his way into town, and he meets up with William Farel. And William Farel, remember, had been in Geneva for a couple of years. He had been starting the process of Reformation. William Farel was a very passionate, very fiery guy. Remember, history, this is not me, this is history recording in a number of places that he was a red-headed guy, I think suggesting to us that he was a person of a very fiery temperament. You decide if that stereotype is true or not. That's just what history has recorded quite a number of times. And remember, as they're eating dinner in Geneva, Calvin is saying, I'm not coming, I don't want to come, I just want to be left, leave me alone so that I can write. And remember, Farel says to him, if you don't come to Geneva, then may God curse the work that you are going to do. And Calvin takes that to heart, and he realizes that he can't escape that sense that if he doesn't stay, then God is going to, in fact, curse him. And so he agrees to stay on in Geneva. And that's where we left it 2 weeks ago. But when Calvin agrees to stay on there, and this is in the year 1536. This is shortly after the city has adopted the official teachings of the Reformation. So Geneva has the city council, or the city residents of Geneva have voted. They gathered together on a Sunday in May in 1536, and they vote together as a city to officially become a Reformed or a Protestant city. And so the teachings of the Reformation are now sort of woven into the official public life of the city of Geneva. And so they need someone to come and implement those reforms. They need somebody who can come along and help the city practice what they've now adopted. And that is going to fall to Calvin. Now, Calvin gets into town, and at first he even though he agreed to sort of implement the Reformation teachings, at first he did not agree to be a pastor. He was going to be a teacher, so his plan was to give lectures and to expound on the teachings of the Reformation. And he's doing that, but it's a little while, I forget exactly how long, it's probably a couple months, maybe a month or 6 weeks or so, before he actually steps into his role, not just as a teacher, but also as a pastor. So those two things were kept separate, but for Calvin, they kind of merged into one thing. This is in September of 1536. So city adopts the teachings in May of 1536. September, Calvin begins his ministry there. Now, as I was reading about this, I had a renewed and deepening appreciation for Sunny Slope Church, because every 2 weeks I collect my paycheck, and I'm thankful for that. Calvin did not get paid for like 6 or 7 months. The city believed that he was really I don't, I think they didn't think that he was going to really amount to that much. He was just going to be kind of one of these other people and nobody was going to pay a lot of attention. I don't know why they came to that conclusion, but they did, and as a result, Calvin began working in September. He didn't collect a paycheck until February. I have no idea how he ate, or I'm sure people probably just brought him food and that sort of thing, but he didn't. It was kind of one of these funny things where the city, and until the city actually voted to pay him a sum of 6 gold crowns, which I have no idea how much money that is, probably not a whole lot, but that was for 6 months worth of work. So anyways, it was kind of an interesting little bit of trivia that I found that the city just didn't bother to pay him for all that time. But the main point here is that he's starting his work as a public teacher, and his first order of business is to teach through the writings of St. Paul. So he's giving his lectures every day, and he's lecturing from Paul, and he's beginning soon after that to preach. And as I said last time, his preaching ministry consisted of at least 2 sermons on a Sunday, and then usually 1 sermon every other day after that, and then teaching in the morning. So he was heavily involved in teaching and preaching ministry. He was also doing pastoral care, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but so he was involved in visiting people. He was involved in a lot of church discipline, which I'm going to say something about in a minute, because that became a big part of his ministry for good and for not so good maybe, because as you'll see, the reformers had a tendency to be pretty heavy-handed when it came to church discipline. So he steps in and begins implementing these reforms. Now, you have to understand something about the city of Geneva. Geneva today is a beautiful city. I showed you some pictures of it a few weeks ago. It's, peaceful, tranquil city on the lake. It's kind of sophisticated. The food is really good. Back then, Geneva would have been much closer to Las Vegas. Geneva was a city that had a huge reputation for being very, very immoral. Prostitution was not only legal, but it was state sanctioned. They actually had someone in my understanding was that it was a person either in government or connected to government or had support of the government. I'll try my French here. It was the Reine de Bordel, which is the queen of the brothel. So the queen of the brothel, her job was to oversee all the brothels in the city and make sure that they're running smoothly. Whatever that means, I have no idea, but that was this person's job. And that gives you a sense that maybe a sense of what the immorality was like in Geneva. There was all kinds of gambling, drunkenness, sexual immorality. Yes, people went to church. Yes, people professed their faith and their religion, but the rest of the time they were doing whatever they pleased and living in any way that they saw fit. So it was a very immoral city. And when Calvin and other reformers are asked to step in and bring some governance to this, they have a huge task ahead of them. You can imagine, right? Imagine today planting a church in Las Vegas, but not only that, your task as a church planter is to reform the whole city in terms of not just their theology, but also their way of life, their living, their morality. I wouldn't want that job. I don't know about you, I wouldn't sign up for that. But that was Calvin's job, and as I will keep emphasizing, Calvin was not alone in this. There were at least 3 other main pastors in Geneva, and then there are other sort of lay leadership, that you might call them as well. So these reforms were not just Calvin's idea coming into town and saying, here's what we're going to do. These were what the city wanted these changes. Other pastors were trying to implement it, but the city as a whole was very, very immoral. Michael.
The city votes to become Protestant.
Mm-hmm.
What's the business agenda of the people who voted? Why would they want to be Protestant, given what you just said?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think one of the answers is that it was a political move. Let me say 2 things. I think part of it is you've got some people who really did want the reforms, and then you've got some people who just wanted political freedom from Rome. So they all kind of, we'll sign on to this. And then probably there are some that maybe didn't know what they were really getting into. But it's a weird anomaly that you've got this city that professes they want all these changes. So they get the changes and now they don't want them and they kick out the reformers. It is a strange thing, and I think you're right to notice that.
So when they kick out the reformers,
mm-hmm.
they revert to Catholicism?
They know what happens is the city government tries to implement the reforms on their own, and it doesn't go very well. It turns out that the city needed some of this heavy-handedness, and you also have to remember that there are some within the city that, yes, they wanted the reforms, but again, it was a political thing. They're willing to speak about being reformed, but they just wanted freedom from Roman authority, and so they weren't really serious about the reforms. They wanted the power essentially for themselves. So and that's where we keep coming to this, and I think rightfully so, this tension between civil government and church leadership or spiritual government. In Geneva, those two things are really, really tightly woven together. And probably, not probably, in my opinion, very much in a way that was not helpful. I won't say too much about this, but the churches, we continue to deal with this, right? How does church and government fit together? How do Christians and government fit together? Christian nationalism, maybe you've heard of that, you're familiar with that. That's sort of this blending of politics and faith in a way that just makes me really, really uneasy. But that's a topic for another time, or not for a long time. Because it's a touchy subject, but it's an important one, and I think you see the lessons of Geneva that kind of we can learn from them even yet today. Are there any other questions, by the way, so far on where we've been to this point? So some of the reforms that Calvin and the others implement, liturgical reforms. So this, in some ways, this was not probably quite as controversial, but in some ways, the politics of it did get in the way. Calvin wanted the Lord's Supper celebrated at least monthly. I think if Calvin had his way, he would have done it every week. Actually, I'm certain he would have done it every week. That's what he said he wanted. He believed the Lord's Supper should be every week. But he was willing to settle for every month because the city wanted it every quarter. So he said, that wasn't a hill he was going to die on, so okay, every month is fine with him. So Calvin was okay with that. Calvin wanted only psalms in singing and no musical instrumentation. He did not, so the musical instruments were the people's voices. To this day, there is a branch within Reformed and Presbyterian churches that are still exclusive psalms and no instruments. And I will say that I'm not fully persuaded by that, but I've come to appreciate more why it is that way. And I will say that the people who practice that they really do a good job of using their voices as musical instruments. And but that was what Calvin wanted. So that in some ways that's consistent. I would not argue that it is. Like I said, I'm not fully persuaded that it must be that way, but when those that practice that, for those that is their conviction, I think we have something to learn from that, even if we don't fully agree with their conclusion. Calvin, here's one here's a point of controversy that you and I would think should not be a sticking point, but it actually turned out to be quite a big issue, and that is the use of unleavened bread in communion. We are having the Lord's Supper this morning. We will be using leavened bread, right? I think it's a sourdough loaf. So, it's a normal loaf of bread that you'd buy at Roth's or Winco, because that's often where we buy it. Although I think Sarah or Jamie is still making it, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But it's like regular bread. That's what Calvin wanted in worship, but not for the reasons that you might think. Calvin wanted, there was a group of sort of reformed leaders in Bern, the capital of Switzerland, and they wanted unleavened bread in communion all across Switzerland. And they were trying to essentially make all the Reformed churches adopt the practice of using unleavened bread in communion. Now, Calvin didn't feel really strongly one way or the other. But what Calvin and the other reformers did resist is the fact that someone else was telling them how to do this. So there's where you see this church politics thing kind of coming into play. They didn't want other churches from, a few hundred miles or however far away telling the people in Geneva, this is how you have to celebrate the Lord's Supper. So they were resistant to that. And that came to, later on, that will come out again. So I'm kind of drawing your attention to that now, but just understand that becomes a flashpoint later on in Calvin's ministry. Calvin dissolved, Calvin, the the Reformers dissolved the marriages that were Catholic. So any marriage that took place as a Catholic marriage were declared null and void. Well, you can imagine that that's going to cause a stir. You've been married all these years and now you're not married anymore, and presumably that would just mean you have to get remarried in the Reformed Church, but the Reformers decided that any Catholic marriage was not acceptable. They forbade the midwives from baptizing infants. Now again, this is probably not an issue that we deal with today, but think about it. When you have an infant mortality that's considerably higher than it is today, the practice had been that if a baby is born and is going to be in distress, then the midwives could baptize that baby before the baby passed away. Calvin and the Reformers believed that they were not duly authorized to do that, and so they forbade that. Now, I think that actually makes a lot of sense. Part of that comes from the theology of Catholicism that believed that the benefits of the baptism were conveyed by way of the sacrament itself, right? So you baptize someone and it's almost like a magical thing. And so you put the water on and boom, it makes the baptism effective. And Reformers took a different view there, and so they went and they forbade midwives from baptizing infants on the grounds of a different theology of baptism. Now again, you could see how that might cause some distress if you have a city and you've got, your wife is pregnant and giving birth and baby's in distress. You want some assurance that this child is, we'd even say in Reformed circles, a child of the covenant, but now, the minister can't get there for a little while, it might be too late, and so you could see how that might be upsetting, although I think the theology that they were operating from is sound. I think it is the correct theological decision, but you can see from an emotional level how that might be distressing to people in Geneva. The big sticky, well, let me go through a couple of other reforms that were a little less controversial and probably much more appreciated. Catechetical preaching and teaching. So Calvin himself wrote a catechism that he then taught from. It was similar. It was similar to his Institutes, although written in more of a question and answer form. It was intended to teach the doctrines of the Reformation. Luther's catechism was kind of followed a similar pattern, but Luther's catechism was written more for children. Luther did a better job of adapting the language so that children could appreciate it. Calvin wanted to use his catechism to teach the youth, but Calvin was a little more cerebral, his language was a little harder, and historians kind of agree that his catechism was probably not quite as helpful to young people as, say, Luther's was in terms of the pedagogical principles there. Educational reforms in the city. I've said this at least a couple times, that one of the benefits of the Reformation is that they believed in the importance of being able to read. And so how do you learn to read? Well, you go to school for it, and obviously that's obvious to us, but it might have been obvious back then, but it wasn't readily available and accessible. And Calvin insisted that that schools be created to teach these things so that people then could learn to read the Bible in their own language, and thus they could, and it actually long-term had a very beneficial effect. I mean, it raised the educational level of the city of Geneva, so it was a very positive thing. Here's where Calvin and the other reformers probably caused the most tension. Like Michael points out, the citizens of Geneva had wanted these reforms. They gathered together in May, I think it was May, what was it, 21st of 1536. They vote these reforms in. They say, we want to be a reformed city. We need change. And Calvin and the others begin to implement these changes. One of the things that they did is they adopted a subscription of faith. So they come up with essentially a theological and ethical document that said, this is how people need to live if you're going to be reformed. And it spelled out all kinds of moral criteria. It talked about things like, it had everything from a curfew, you couldn't go out past 9 o'clock, those kinds of things. It had, so you could again see the young people of Geneva like, don't tell us to stay in kind of thing. It forbade, prostitution, it forbade gambling, drunkenness, all of these other kinds of moral behaviors that probably you and I would agree, yeah, that's not fitting for Christians, although we may have some quibbling on some of the details of it. But my point is that the reformers adopted this this document, and it was a subscription, it was required that all citizens of Geneva subscribe to this document, committing themselves to living by the teachings of the Reformation. The problem was, and even though the city council adopted it and required that all the citizens sign on to it, many of the citizens then refused to sign on. It was kind of like they said, well, we want to be reformed, but we didn't know this is what was going to be involved in this, and so they sort of rejected the teachings of the Reformation. Along with that, Calvin and the others adopted a means of enforcing this way of life. So in other words, they didn't just say, here's what we think you ought to be doing. They said, if you don't do this, you're going to be punished by the city council if you do it, or if you break the laws and the rules, or if you don't do what you're supposed to do. So, for example, one woman was, I think I'm getting the details right, but one woman was imprisoned because she didn't wear the proper head covering. So I don't know about you, that seems a little harsh, right? Getting thrown in jail for, not because your hat is the wrong kind of hat. This was a man who, I believe he was gambling. I think that was his sin, and he was put in the stocks for 3 days. Again, that seems a little harsh, right? You play a game of cards and you put some money on it. Now, I'm not necessarily saying you should go put some money on cards or gamble or whatever, but, then he spends 3 days in the stocks. That seemed a little bit heavy-handed. And so those are the kinds of things that begin to take place in Geneva, and you can start to imagine how there's a little bit of this resistance, right? You see people don't want to be, they don't want, well, you wouldn't want it either, right? If you're doing something that maybe you shouldn't be, and then there's a knock at the door, and it's City of Salem bylaw enforcement or code enforcement, and they're going to take you down to, council chambers, or the police department's going to take you into the county jail. Well, you can see how that didn't go over. Now, I will say that for some, they love this. There were some people that were thrilled about all the reforms that were taking place, but that was a small group of people, and what was also happening was that around the world, around the known world, around Europe at that time, especially like in England, people were hearing, oh, you should see what's happening in Geneva. It's going really well. So they start flocking to Geneva because they were kind of the same mindset. They were the sort of people that wanted moral reform, and they valued, moral transformation. And so when they hear it's happening in Geneva, they start coming to Geneva. So in that sense, Geneva's population grows, as does the number of people who are embracing these sorts of ideas. But it still wasn't enough to tip the scales in favor of wholesale moral revival. Does that make sense? You kind of see what I'm describing here? So let's say probably more than half the city is resistant to this change. You get some people in the city who love it, and then you get more people who come into the city who also love it, but they still are a minority compared to all the people who are resistant to a lot of these changes that are taking place. So, you could argue that the reforms are working, because Geneva's reputation is improving in terms of, how people view the city. It's not Las Vegas anymore. It's not what happens in Geneva stays in Geneva. It's becoming a little more Bible Belt-ish, if you'd like, if that helps, if the analogy helps you. But there's still this resistance in the city. There's still a lot of people who are resentful about the changes that are taking place. Any questions before I tell you what happens next and how this all started to fall apart on Calvin? Any questions? Michael?
How fair is it to say the reformers did to others what had been done to them?
I think it's very fair to say.
And they don't seem to be carrying out the Great Commission with the gentleness of Jesus and more acting like Pharisees.
Yeah, so I think number one, it's very fair to say, because so Philip Schaff is a pretty well-respected church historian. He's about 120 years old. Well, he's not living anymore. He lived about 120 years ago, and he made that exact observation. He said, because he writes extensively about the Reformation, and he came to that same conclusion that you just pointed out, is that in the process, the citizens of Geneva, and more specifically the reformers, and some people, and maybe it's hagiography a little bit, but they kind of get Calvin a little bit more off the hook, and they place a little more of the blame on people like Farrell, and then there was one other guy who was not as well known, but he had a reputation for being more fiery than Farrell. So you get these two really like passionate, and arguably they shoulder a little more of the blame for this than Calvin does, but Calvin is not innocent, as you'll see later on. You're right, they push off the shackles of Roman Catholic control, and if you're going to be really cynical about it, they do what Jesus warns about, is they make you twice the son of hell, right? Now, I'm not going to go quite that far, but I think that is a very valid observation. Now, was it motivated? I think the other side of it needs to be considered as well, which is Geneva was a really, really licentious and immoral city, and sometimes extreme cases require extreme responses. So how do you fit that together? Well, I think Calvin's second sojourn in Geneva gives us a far better picture. Because Calvin, so what happened, this is the short version of it, which we'll expand as we go on. Calvin leaves Geneva, the people are happy, the city falls apart, they come back to Calvin with their tails between their legs and say, well, we actually need you here. So Calvin comes back, and he's in, I think the reason I say that the second time for Calvin is better in Geneva is because Calvin has gained quite a bit of wisdom. He's more tempered. He learns how to lead in a way that's not quite so heavy-handed. And in the process, I think that that's what was missing this first time. Keep in mind, Calvin is, how many of you, if you had to guess this point in Calvin's life, how old is Calvin at this point? Anyone?
First time around?
First time around, yeah.
Oh gosh, mid-20s?
He's mid-20s. He's, I think, 27 by the time he's exiled. Now, I don't know about you. When I started here at Sunny Slope when I just turned 27. I think back on that now, and there are times I think, boy, I feel really bad for Sunny Slope. They had to put up with a very young and inexperienced pastor at the age of 27. My wife is laughing. But really,
We thought we knew.
we thought, you think you know a lot, and you're coming in with these ideas, and I see it today. I see it in pastors today, colleagues even of mine, where and I did it too. I know I did it too. But they go into these places, and they've just graduated seminary, folks, and they're gonna change things and fix things, and they lack the wisdom and the experience to know how to do that carefully and tenderly and all that. So I think this first sojourn of Calvin does give us that picture of, they needed reform. They really did. Not just theological, but moral as well. But how it was carried out it was not done with the care that was necessary. And Calvin's time in Strasbourg helped him with that. It's probably no small thing that he got married while he was in Strasbourg, and so when he came back, he had a wife that actually apparently was really good for him in some of those ways as well. Yeah,
I think he had about 1,000 years of this concept of Christendom too.
Yeah.
And so
Sure.
you had a certain expectation of the interaction of the church and the state
Yep.
in a way which today we don't.
Right. Exactly right. And that will be important, especially when we get to talking about an event that's now called the Michael Servetus affair. Is anyone familiar with the name Michael Servetus? You will get to be familiar with him by the end of this class, because not this today, but at the end of our study, because here was a guy that theologically was way off base, and today when you have someone theologically way off base, you have a conversation. Back then you get out the guillotine and you chop their heads off or you burn them at the stake, which is what they did in Geneva, and Calvin had a hand in that. History looks very harshly on that, rightfully so in a lot of ways, but there's also cultural assumptions and cultural values that are just baked into that. Terrible choice of words, I probably shouldn't have used that, but that are just woven into that. How about that? That's probably better, given that Servetus was burned at the stake. And anyway, we don't see that. We stand outside of that cultural milieu, and so it's easy for us to look back on that. But like David, like you're saying, there's 1,000 years or more of this relationship between church and state that are so mixed in together that it's hard to separate the one from the other. And yeah, so when Calvin's trying to implement reforms, the city's pushing back, and there's politics that are all woven in, and it's a tough situation. I wouldn't want to pastor in Geneva in Calvin's time. David?
Probably for me, it serves as an example of something I see a lot, that when you oppose something, like the Roman Catholicism or the licentiousness of the city, it's so tempting to become like your enemy.
Yeah, 100%.
Oh, man.
100% true. I think that's a really good lesson for us all. You see it today in public life. You see when you oppose ideas, we don't intend it. We see the enemy over there. We don't realize that the enemy starts to, we become like that, and we have to really guard against that. Whether you're, whatever political side you happen to fall towards, it's true for all of us. Yeah, Jerry.
How is it that Geneva was so immoral under Catholicism?
Well, yeah, good question. The priests were a lot to blame. The priests were ignorant, but they also tolerated this, and they probably even in some ways participated in it, and maybe even encouraged it.
And then you can sell indulgences, and you've made
Yeah.
money for the church, and you've taken care of these immoral acts because you
Right.
wiped them clean.
Right, I had a great Saturday night. I'll be in church on Sunday. Here's a couple of silver coins, clean slate. So in that sense, the system, you're right, the system of indulgences really favors that way of
Geneva
living.
would have been a perfect place
Like-
for it.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's poor leadership. It's bishops and priests who simply had never read the Bible because it wasn't in their language, and thus they had no problem condoning it. And plus, it was a great moneymaker. Like sin turns out was pretty good for the church financially too. So anyway, that's probably a good note to end on, or not. But I will next week. I want to pick up on what happens on Easter Sunday in 1538. This was the straw that breaks the camel's back. This is where everything blows up, and Calvin ends up being exiled from the city. And so, hopefully, it's giving you kind of a sense of how things are in Geneva under Calvin's first stab at leadership, and then how Calvin had to be humbled, and how change then took place. And we'll kind of then go from there into Geneva the second go around. But let's close in prayer. Father, we thank you that you deal with people not in their perfected state, but in their brokenness and in their fallenness. The Bible is full of stories of people who are far, far from perfect. History is full of people who are far, far from perfect. And yet, you, in your graciousness and in your sovereignty, you use imperfect people to bring change and renewal and growth. And that happened in Geneva 500 some years ago. It continues to happen today, and for that we're thankful. Help us to learn the lessons that we can learn from Calvin and his ministry, from his time in Geneva. Help us to learn that, so that going forward, that we can consider more and more what it means for us to be Christ-like. In the rest of our day together, we ask your blessing on our time of worship, on the rest that we have, and then we ask that you prepare us for a week ahead, whatever it is that you have us to do. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.